Before history, before the first word was etched into clay, before even the faintest whisper of civilization, there was a world that existed in silence. A silence so vast, it seemed infinite. It was not the silence of absence, but the silence of a planet still dreaming, a world whose story had not yet been written, a world waiting for memory to begin. If we could stand on the edges of time and gaze back into that abyss, we would see a planet in constant motion. Continents were not where we know them today. They drifted like enormous rafts across the mantle of the earth, colliding, splitting, and reshaping the face of the globe. Entire lands appeared and disappeared, swallowed by oceans, born again in fire. To us, it might seem chaotic, but to the earth, it was rhythm, an ancient heartbeat pulsing through stone and water. The continents we inhabit today, Africa, Asia, Europe, the Americas, Oceania, are not eternal. They are only chapters in an ever-changing story, fragments of what once was. Before them, there were older worlds, supercontinents like Gondwana and Pangaea, and countless smaller lands that existed only for a brief geological breath before vanishing beneath the tides. Among these forgotten realms was a continent that once stood proud above the seas, a place where forests swayed, rivers carved valleys, and creatures unknown to us wandered freely. Today, it is gone, its bones buried beneath waves, its memory erased from all but the hidden stones that lie deep below. Yet, perhaps the most haunting truth is this: on that land, life did not merely exist, it thrived. And one day, into this world of towering beasts, volcanic mountains, and endless forests, came a new figure. Fragile, barefoot, armed only with stone and fire, humanity. But before we arrive at them, the first tribes, the dreamers, the storytellers, we must pause. Because to understand their journey, we must understand the stage upon which they walked. The earth was not passive, it was an actor itself, shaping destiny. Every mountain that rose, every river that twisted, every coast that vanished into the sea, guided the footsteps of our ancestors. Geography was not background, it was fate. Imagine, for a moment, the sheer scale of time we are dealing with. Human memory reaches back perhaps 10,000 years, to the first cities, the first writing. But the continent we seek belongs to an age stretching far deeper, tens of thousands of years ago, when glaciers swallowed the north, when oceans were lower, when the horizon was drawn differently. This was a time when the map of the world was unfamiliar, when lands we call lost were as real to the first tribes as our cities are to us today. It is humbling to remember that 99% of human history is unwritten. We do not know their names. We do not know their languages. We do not know the exact shape of their beliefs. What remains are only fragments, a footprint hardened into volcanic ash, a chipped flint blade buried in soil, the charred remnants of an ancient fire. These fragments are all we have to rebuild their stories, and yet, when pieced together, they whisper of lives both ordinary and extraordinary. In the stillness of night, by firelight, they would have looked up at the same stars we see today. The constellations above them were unchanged: Orion, the Pleiades, the Milky Way, sweeping across the heavens. Did they give them names? Did they tell their children stories of the hunter in the sky, of spirits moving through the night? We cannot know for certain, but we can feel the echo. For the instinct to wonder, to imagine, to explain the unexplainable, is as old as humanity itself. The lost continent was more than land, it was a canvas for human beginnings. On its soils, the first migrations paused, the first camps were built, the first fires lit. Here, hunger was met with ingenuity, fear with courage, and isolation with the power of community. This was the dawn, not of civilization, but of something more fragile and more enduring, the dawn of belonging. We must picture this world not as a blur of prehistory, but as a living, breathing place. Dense jungles draped in mist, rivers that shone silver beneath the rising sun, vast plains where herds of animals thundered across the horizon, shores littered with shells and driftwood, where children played as waves lapped at their feet, and in the distance, mountains wreathed in smoke, guardians of fire and stone. This was the world before memory, and yet, it shaped every memory that would follow. It was here that the human story took one of its first steps. It was here that a people, long forgotten, walked with bare feet across a land that no longer exists. Philosophers say that to forget is to die twice, once in body, once in memory. If that is true, then continents too die when they are forgotten. The land we seek, this continent swallowed by time and tide, has died that second death. And yet, we are here, searching for it, speaking of it, remembering it anew. In this act of remembrance, we breathe life back into it. The tribes who lived there, though nameless, were not faceless. They laughed, they wept, they feared storms, they rejoiced at the birth of children. They were, in every essential way, us. To imagine them is not fantasy, it is reflection. For in their struggles, we find the roots of our own. So let us step onto this vanished land, not as archaeologists sifting for bones, but as travelers of imagination. Let us feel the soil beneath our feet, hear the rustle of unseen animals in the forest, smell the smoke of distant fires. Let us walk with them, the first tribes of the lost continent, and listen for their voices, still echoing faintly across the corridors of time. To speak of a continent that has vanished is to stand at the edge of mystery. It invites us into a strange space between fact and imagination, between what science can measure and what memory, myth, and longing have preserved. Throughout human history, people have whispered of lands now lost to the sea, realms where tribes once thrived, cultures once flourished, and where perhaps the story of humanity itself was shaped. We call them by many names: Atlantis, Lemuria, Mu. But behind every legend lies a shadow of truth. The earth is not static. Its surface is restless, forever shifting, pulled apart by the slow breathing of tectonic plates, then stitched together again in collisions of unimaginable force. Oceans rise and fall with the rhythm of the ice ages, exposing vast plains during one era, only to bury them beneath waves in the next. To live upon such a planet is to live upon something fleeting, a stage that constantly rearranges itself. What feels eternal to us is, in reality, fragile. Entire landscapes can vanish, not in the blink of an eye, but in the slow, inevitable tides of geological time. Among the most intriguing of these forgotten places are the submerged lands of the last ice age. Sundaland, once stretching across Southeast Asia, was larger than India, its fertile plains, home to rivers, forests, and tribes who left behind tantalizing traces of their presence. Sahul, the vast landmass once connecting Australia to New Guinea and Tasmania, carried marsupial giants and early humans across bridges of grasslands that no longer exist. Zealandia, now almost entirely drowned beneath the Pacific, was once a continent in its own right, its mountain peaks surviving only as the islands we now call New Zealand. These names belong not to myth, but to geology. They remind us that the so-called lost continents were not fictions invented by dreamers, but physical realities, their bones lying quietly beneath the oceans. And yet, myth clings to them, because what has been lost to the sea is not only stone and soil, but memory. People once walked these places. They fished in their rivers, built shelters on their shores, and sang songs under their skies. When the waters rose, those songs were carried away, leaving behind only faint echoes in the oral traditions of their descendants. It is no accident that flood myths are among the most common of human stories. From Mesopotamia's tale of Utnapishtim to the biblical deluge of Noah, from Hindu accounts of Manu's great rescue to Polynesian stories of drowned islands, cultures across the world have preserved memories of rising seas and sunken lands. They tell of gods angered, of worlds cleansed, of survivors floating toward new beginnings. Could these myths be faint recollections of real events, the drowning of Sundaland, Sahul, or other now forgotten continents? It is not impossible. The line between legend and history is often thinner than we imagine. But the vanished continent we seek is not only about the land itself. It is about what it meant to those who first lived there. To early humans, land was more than soil. It was security, identity, and belonging. A continent offered abundance, rivers teeming with fish, plains crowded with game, forests rich with fruit and shelter. To lose it was not merely to lose a home, but to lose an entire world. We must imagine how disorienting it would have been, watching shorelines creep inland year after year, forests swallowed by saltwater, familiar hunting grounds disappearing forever. And yet, within this loss lay the seeds of adaptation. Tribes that once walked freely across vast lowlands were forced to become wanderers, sailors, inventors. They learned to cross straits, to carve canoes, to navigate by stars. In the drowning of continents, humanity was reshaped. The vanishing of one world gave birth to another. Consider the imagery: a mother holding her child on the edge of a retreating shoreline, watching as the sea reclaims the land where her ancestors hunted. A tribe debating whether to stay or flee, torn between memory and survival. Fires lit at night on higher ground, as if to hold back the encroaching waves. These are scenes we will never truly see, but they are etched into our imagination. They remind us that human history has always been entwined with the Earth's shifting face. Today, when we speak of the lost continent, we do so with both wonder and melancholy. It is wonder because we are drawn to the idea of hidden worlds, lands waiting to be rediscovered beneath the ocean. It is melancholy because we know that those worlds are gone, perhaps forever. Yet, through science and myth alike, we can begin to glimpse their outlines. Archaeologists dive into submerged caves and pull from the silt ancient tools and bones. Geologists trace the scars of rivers that once flowed across plains now drowned. Linguists hear in the chants of distant tribes echoes of stories that may stretch back to those vanished homelands. Each fragment is a thread, and together they weave a tapestry that brings the lost continent back to life. And so, the vanished continent is not merely a place. It is a symbol. It speaks of impermanence, of the fragility of worlds we take for granted, of the resilience of those who endure after the land beneath their feet disappears. It asks us to reflect on how much of human history is hidden, how many chapters have been erased, and how many stories remain untold beneath the waves. The first tribes who lived there did not think of themselves as part of myth. To them, it was simply home. They walked its forests, feared its storms, laughed in its sunlight. They did not know that one day their continent would vanish and their memory would survive only in whispers. Yet here we are, speaking their story again, calling them back into being. This is the continent that vanished. Not just stone and soil, but a cradle of humanity. Not just lost geography, but lost memory. And in remembering it, we take our first true step into the world of the first tribes. Before the first tribes walked upon it, before even the forests spread their roots, the lost continent was born from fire. To understand it, we must imagine the earth not as we see it today, quiet and stable, but as a restless body, alive with heat and motion beneath its crust. Deep below, molten rock churned like a slow tide, pushing, pulling, breaking apart the land above. Continents drifted, collided, and tore themselves open. Mountains rose with the force of clenched fists, and valleys split like scars across the surface of the world. It is tempting to think of continents as eternal, but they are fragile creations, forever reshaped by the hidden engines of the earth. The continent we now call lost was no exception. It was carved in violence, born of tectonic shifts, lifted from the ocean floor, then reshaped again by eruptions and floods. Fire was its architect, and water would one day be its destroyer. Imagine standing upon that land in its youth. To the horizon, columns of smoke rose into the sky, their plumes staining the air with ash. Volcanoes rumbled like giants stirring in their sleep, spilling rivers of molten rock across plains. Lava hardened into black stone, cracked by heat and rain, and from that stone came soil rich enough to feed forests. The air trembled with the constant hum of creation. To us, it would have been terrifying. To the earth, it was simply the rhythm of becoming. Out of this chaos came landscapes of startling beauty. The continent was not uniform but diverse. Mountain chains veined with fire, vast lowlands cut by rivers, coasts fringed with mangrove swamps, and inland seas sparkling beneath the sun. Forests draped the hillsides, their roots gripping the volcanic soil. Strange creatures roamed these lands, some colossal, others delicate, each adapted to this shifting stage. Life, in all its resilience, had learned not only to endure the planet's violence but to thrive upon it. The fire beneath the earth was more than destruction. It was fertility. Ashes that fell upon the ground became nourishment, rich with minerals. Rivers carried those minerals into plains where grasses flourished, feeding herds of animals. When lightning struck the forests, flames tore through the undergrowth, but soon after, new growth sprouted, fresher, greener, stronger. Fire and life were bound together in an endless cycle of death and renewal. For the first humans who would one day arrive, this was both a blessing and a curse. Fire was a threat, but also a gift. To see a mountain erupt would have been to witness the gods themselves, to tremble at the raw power of the world. Yet, the same forces that terrified also created abundance. Rich soils meant plentiful plants. The aftermath of volcanic destruction meant fertile hunting grounds. In time, humans would learn not only to fear fire but to harness it, to carry embers from lightning-scorched trees, to build their own flames, to turn fire into a tool of survival. But long before that, the land itself bore the scars of fire. Rivers traced paths carved by lava flows. Valleys stretched where land had been torn apart. Even now, beneath the sea, geologists can trace these scars, submerged ridges, ancient coastlines, the bones of volcanoes that once towered above the horizon. They tell a story written not in words, but in stone, a story of how the continent rose and how it would one day fall. We often think of continents as solid, immovable. Yet, they are more like rafts floating upon the restless currents of the Earth's mantle. The lost continent drifted, pressed against neighboring plates, fractured under pressure. Each collision reshaped it. Each shift altered its climate, its ecosystems, its future. To early humans, these changes were invisible across a lifetime. But across centuries, across millennia, they meant the difference between abundance and exile. The bones of the earth held fire, and that fire dictated destiny. Where volcanoes rose, soil became fertile. Where land fractured, rivers pooled into fertile valleys. Where coastlines shifted, new hunting grounds appeared, then vanished. The tribes who walked here did not yet know of tectonic plates or volcanic cycles, but they felt the earth's pulse. They saw mountains smoke. They saw the sea creep closer. And they knew they lived upon something alive. It is humbling to remember that our ancestors were not separate from this drama. They were participants. They built their camps on land carved by eruptions. They crossed rivers born of melting glaciers. They watched horizons transform with fire and flood. Their lives were woven into the same cycles of creation and destruction that shaped the land itself. Perhaps that is why so many myths, from faraway islands to distant deserts, speak of gods of fire and stone, gods who shake the earth and breathe smoke into the sky. These stories may be echoes of the landscapes our ancestors knew, landscapes where the earth revealed its power not in whispers, but in thunderous roars. To live on such a continent was to live in the presence of giants. The lost continent's legacy, then, is not only one of disappearance. It is one of creation. Fire shaped it, water reshaped it, and humanity adapted to it. The tribes who first set foot here were not wandering upon passive ground. They were walking upon a land alive with heat, a land whose very bones burned. And though the continent itself would one day vanish, the lessons it taught, resilience, adaptation, reverence for the earth's power, would endure in those who survived. To understand the lost continent, we must carry this dual truth: it was a place of beauty and a place of violence. A paradise and a crucible. A land where creation and destruction danced endlessly, each giving birth to the other. It was upon this stage, forged in fire, that humanity would take its next steps. Long before cities rose, long before nations carved borders across the earth, there was only the endless wilderness. Forests stretched unbroken, rivers wandered freely, and the horizon seemed without end. Into this vastness came a fragile figure, a human, small against the immensity of the world, yet carrying within them the fire of survival. They were not alone. With them came families, tribes, generations that moved like shadows across the land. And one day, they stepped onto the lost continent, leaving behind the first human footprints upon its soil. The journey that led them here began far away in Africa, the cradle of our kind. For hundreds of thousands of years, humanity's earliest ancestors had lived upon its savannas and grasslands, learning to walk upright, to shape stone into tools, to gather and hunt. Then, slowly, wave after wave of migration began. Some left to follow herds across drying plains. Others were pushed by drought, by competition, by curiosity. They crossed deserts, followed rivers, hugged coastlines, and moved into unknown worlds. Each step carried them farther from their origin, until at last their wandering brought them to the shores of new continents. To arrive upon the lost continent was to step into a land both familiar and alien. The air carried scents unknown, the forests echoed with cries of beasts unseen, the rivers teemed with fish that no ancestor had ever caught. To us, such a journey would seem impossibly perilous. To them, it was life itself, the rhythm of movement, the eternal search for food, water, and shelter. They had no maps, no borders, no certainty of what lay ahead. Only instinct, courage, and the memory of those who had walked before. Archaeologists searching for traces of these first wanderers often find little more than stone tools, the simplest of artifacts. A sharp flake chipped from flint, a hand axe smoothed by use. To the modern eye, they are small, almost unimpressive. Yet in them lies the story of survival. That edge of stone meant the difference between hunger and a successful hunt, between danger and defense. With it, they skinned animals, carved wood, and cut through the stubborn fibers of plants. These tools were not just objects, they were extensions of thought, evidence that the human mind was becoming something new. And then there are the footprints. In rare places, where volcanic ash hardened into stone, the delicate impressions of bare feet have been preserved for tens of thousands of years. They tell us that families walked together, adults and children, side by side. Sometimes the tracks show hesitation, a pause, a moment of uncertainty. At other times, they show running, as if in fear or excitement. These footprints are not just marks in the earth, they are frozen moments of life, the most intimate connection we can have with people who lived so long ago. We can imagine the scene, a tribe crossing an open plain at dawn, their silhouettes stretched long in the rising sun. A child stumbles, and a parent reaches down to lift them. A hunter carries a bundle of reeds for weaving, while others carry embers from the last fire, carefully wrapped in bark and moss to preserve the flame. They speak to one another in words we will never know, yet the rhythm of their voices is human, familiar. In their laughter and in their weariness, they are us. To walk into a new land was to face the unknown. There were dangers in every direction, predators lurking in forests, rivers swollen with floodwaters, cliffs that crumbled without warning. Yet, there was also abundance. The lost continent offered fresh game, fertile soils, and coastlines rich with shellfish. For the first arrivals, it must have seemed like both promise and peril, a place of opportunity shadowed by uncertainty. The courage required cannot be overstated. These were not migrations planned with certainty. They were journeys of faith, faith that the land ahead would provide, faith that the tribe would endure. Many must have perished. Some rivers may have been too wide to cross. Some forests may have held sickness. Yet enough survived that slowly, this continent became home. Campsites appeared along riverbanks, shelters were built from branches and hides, and fires glowed against the dark of night. The first fires on this land must have seemed like small miracles. Imagine a circle of figures huddled around glowing embers, the night alive with distant animal calls. Sparks rose into the air, carrying with them the first stories told upon this continent. Perhaps they spoke of the land they had left behind, or of spirits who lived in the mountains, or of ancestors who watched them from the stars. Whatever they said, those words, carried by firelight, marked the beginning of human presence in this place. Evidence suggests that early humans were not only survivors but explorers of mind. They painted, carved, and left behind symbols that hint at a capacity for imagination. On the lost continent, perhaps caves held the outlines of animals painted in ochre and charcoal. Perhaps bones were carved into ornaments, worn as charms for protection. These gestures, small though they seem, were the beginnings of culture, signs that humanity was becoming more than survival alone. And so, the first footprints upon the lost continent were more than physical impressions. They were the beginnings of memory. Every step taken across its plains, every hunt, every song, every burial, was a thread in the tapestry of human history. We may never know their names, but their presence endures, etched into the earth and into us. For in our DNA, in our shared humanity, their journey continues. To imagine them is to bridge the gulf of time. They were not strangers. They were mothers and fathers, children and elders. They knew hunger and joy, fear and love. They laughed at jokes around fires, wept at the loss of kin, and dreamed of tomorrow. Their world was raw, dangerous, and uncertain, but in their endurance, they laid the foundation for everything that would follow. When we speak of the lost continent, we must remember that it was not the land alone that mattered. It was the people who first set foot upon it, whose courage turned wilderness into home. Their footprints may have long since vanished beneath forests and seas, but in telling their story, we bring them back to life. The first footprints mark the true beginning. They are the threshold of our journey into the lost world, faint, fragile, yet indelible. They remind us that every great story begins with a single step. If the mountains were the bones of the lost continent, then its rivers were the veins through which life flowed. From highland springs, waters tumbled down valleys, carving channels into the land, winding endlessly toward seas that would one day rise to swallow them. To the first tribes, these rivers were more than geography. They were lifelines, teachers, and storytellers, silent companions that carried both sustenance and memory. The earliest humans who walked this continent quickly learned that to follow the water was to find survival. Rivers offered fish in abundance, reeds for weaving, clay for shaping, and fresh water for drinking. Along their banks grew fruit trees and edible plants, attracting animals that came to drink. To camp by a river was to place oneself within a circle of life, where every need could be met if knowledge was deep enough and patience was long enough. But rivers were never still. They shifted their courses with floods, split into countless tributaries, and swallowed whole stretches of forest when rains were heavy. For a tribe living close to the land, this was both danger and opportunity. Floods destroyed camps, yet when waters retreated, they left behind rich soils where plants flourished. The river's movements reminded the first tribes that nothing in their world was permanent, not even the land beneath their feet. Archaeologists who study prehistoric river valleys often find fragments of tools, bones, and fire pits buried in the silt. Each layer tells of families who once rested there, of hunts prepared, of fires that warmed children at night. A chipped blade lying in river mud is not just a tool, it is the residue of a moment, a person kneeling on the bank, shaping stone with patient strikes, the rhythm of survival echoing with each blow. These remnants are the closest we come to hearing the whispers of those who lived by the waters. For the tribes themselves, rivers must have carried meanings far beyond practicality. To see a river winding endlessly to the horizon was to see a path of time itself, flowing from a mysterious beginning toward an unseen end. Perhaps they believed that souls traveled with the waters, moving downstream into other worlds. Perhaps they sang songs that followed the rhythm of the current, passing knowledge from parent to child like a river passing silt to the sea. At night, when the stars mirrored themselves upon still waters, the river became a double sky. The first tribes must have looked into these reflections and wondered if two worlds existed, one above, one below. Myths may have been born here, in the shimmering dialogue between stars and currents. To drink from a river was not only to quench thirst, but to partake in a cosmic cycle, water falling as rain, gathering into streams, flowing to the ocean, rising again as clouds, beginning anew. Children would have played along the shallows, chasing fish with laughter, skipping stones across the surface. Elders would have sat in silence, watching the current and recalling the journeys of their youth. Hunters would have scanned the water's edge for tracks of animals that came to drink. In every age, in every season, the river was present, a constant companion in a world of constant change. And yet, rivers were not always kind. Crocodiles lurked in the shallows, striking without warning. Torrential rains turned calm waters into raging floods, sweeping away shelters and lives. To live by a river was to live with risk, but it was a risk worth taking. The abundance outweighed the danger. Over time, the tribes learned patterns, when the waters would swell, when fish would gather, when reeds would be strongest for weaving. In these patterns lay survival, and in survival lay memory. To speak of memory in a prehistoric world may sound strange, but memory is not only written in books or carved in stone. Memory is held in practice, in repetition, in ritual. When a mother taught her daughter how to weave reeds into baskets, she was passing on memory. When a hunter showed his son how to spear fish in the shallows, he was teaching memory. When elders told stories beside the river, warning of floods or speaking of spirits, they were binding memory to place. The river itself became a library, holding knowledge in its cycles, its gifts, and its dangers. Some rivers ran so wide that to cross them seemed impossible. Yet necessity gave birth to invention. The first rafts may have been nothing more than bundles of reeds tied together, but with them, tribes could reach new lands, hunt on the opposite bank, or escape floods. From such small experiments, the seeds of seafaring were planted. In this way, rivers were not boundaries, but bridges, carrying humanity toward discovery. Even today, when we walk along riverbanks and see the remains of ancient camps, we can almost feel the presence of those who once sat there. The laughter of children seems hidden in the reeds. The smell of smoke lingers faintly in the soil. The river flows on, unchanged in its essence, a living thread connecting past to present. It remembers, even if we have forgotten. The rivers of the lost continent, like the continent itself, are now gone, submerged, rerouted, erased by time and tide. Yet, in the myths of flood and creation that echo across human cultures, their memory endures. They remind us that water is not only life, but story. It carries forward what we cannot hold, what we cannot preserve. And so, when we speak of the first tribes who lived upon this vanished land, we must picture them not as wanderers upon an empty stage, but as people bound to rivers, shaped by their flows, their floods, their mysteries. In the current of those rivers ran not only fish and silt, but the memory of humanity's beginnings. The lost continent was not only a land of rivers and forests. It was also home to creatures so vast, so strange, that they seemed to belong to another world entirely. To walk its plains or forests was to share the ground with giants, predators, and beings whose very presence forced the first tribes into awe and caution. These were the beasts of the lost continent, animals that shaped not only the ecosystem, but also the imagination of humanity's earliest ancestors. Among the most formidable were the towering proboscideans, distant relatives of the elephant. Some had curving tusks, like crescents of ivory that gleamed in the sunlight. Others had shaggy coats against the cold, their massive bulk moving like mountains with legs. To see such a creature emerge from the morning mist would have been both terrifying and mesmerizing. For the tribes, they were a source of meat, bone, and hide, but also symbols of strength and endurance. Hunting one meant risking lives, yet succeeding meant survival for weeks. Equally imposing were the giant herbivores that grazed in open valleys. There were ancient rhinoceroses with horns sharp as spears, capable of goring any predator bold enough to challenge them. Herds of giant bison thundered across grasslands, their hooves beating a rhythm that echoed for miles. Each migration reshaped the landscape, flattening paths through forests and stirring clouds of dust that marked the turning of seasons. For the tribes, these migrations were both opportunity and ordeal, a chance for food, but also a test of skill and bravery. But not all beasts were gentle grazers. In the shadowed thickets, predators stalked. Saber-toothed cats, with fangs long as daggers, lay in ambush. Their eyes glowed in the half-light, their movements silent as drifting smoke. To encounter one was to stand face to face with raw, efficient death. The first tribes must have learned to read every sign: paw prints in the mud, broken branches, sudden silence among birds, for survival depended on knowing when a predator was near. Around campfires, such encounters would become stories, warnings passed from elder to child. There were also creatures that seemed almost mythic. Giant sloths, towering above men, moved with slow power, their claws scythe-like and capable of tearing through bark and flesh alike. Giant birds, flightless but swift, patrolled the open plains, their beaks heavy and sharp, their gaze unblinking. To hunt such birds was to pit human cunning against speed and ferocity. Even reptiles, remnants of older ages, lingered. Crocodiles stretched longer than canoes, lurking in rivers where tribes drew water. To step carelessly into the shallows was to risk being seized and dragged beneath. Imagine the emotional impact these beasts had on the first tribes. A child's earliest memory may have been the trembling earth as mammoths passed. A hunter's deepest fear may have been the sudden snarl of a predator in tall grass. A mother's whispered warning to her children might have invoked the name of a creature, half real, half myth, that stalked beyond the firelight. In this way, animals were not only food or threat, they were characters in the unfolding drama of human life. The relationship was never one-sided. Humans influenced the beasts as well. When tribes coordinated hunts, driving animals into traps or over cliffs, they altered populations. When they burned grasslands to flush game, they changed habitats. The balance between human need and animal abundance was delicate, shifting with every generation. Sometimes the scales tipped too far, and creatures vanished forever. To the people of the time, these disappearances may have seemed mysterious, even spiritual, as if great beings had simply walked out of the world. Yet the memory of them lived on. Long after a predator disappeared, its image might remain carved in bone, painted on rock, or carried in story. These stories likely exaggerated details, magnifying the danger until the animals became larger in memory than they were in life. Over centuries, beasts turned into myths, and myths became part of cultural identity. In this way, even extinction could not erase them. Philosophically, the presence of such creatures raises profound questions. What did the first tribes think when they looked upon a mammoth or a saber-tooth? Did they feel small, fragile, humbled by the scale of life? Did they see in these beasts reflections of themselves, strength, endurance, family bonds, or violence? Perhaps, in observing them, early humans began to form the seeds of philosophy, asking what it meant to share a world with such beings and what place humanity truly held within it. We cannot know the precise thoughts of those ancient people, but the evidence in art and in bones suggests reverence, fear, and respect. Animals were not merely beasts, they were teachers. A wolf pack taught the value of cooperation. A herd of mammoths showed the strength of unity. A stalking predator revealed the cost of inattention. Through these lessons, tribes shaped their own codes of survival and meaning. Today, when we look back across the millennia, we often imagine the prehistoric world as one of empty landscapes dotted with small groups of people. But the truth is more dramatic. It was a stage crowded with giants. Humanity's story did not begin in isolation, but in dialogue with immense creatures that towered, hunted, and roamed alongside us. The lost continent was alive with these encounters, moments of fear, triumph, and awe that shaped the trajectory of human evolution. And so, when we speak of the beasts of the lost continent, we speak not only of vanished species, but of vanished relationships. They remind us that humanity was never alone, that our journey has always been intertwined with the lives of other beings. To lose them is to lose part of our own reflection. In their bones, buried beneath silt and stone, we find not just animals, but echoes of ourselves. Their silence today is a reminder of fragility, of the delicate balance between survival and extinction. Yet, in remembering them, in imagining the tribes who stood before them in awe, we keep their presence alive. The beasts are gone, the continent submerged, but the memory of their power still lingers, in fossils, in myths, and in the imagination of those who dream of what once was. If there is a single moment that separates humanity from the countless other creatures of the lost continent, it is the moment fire was claimed. Not lightning strike, not a volcano's eruption, not the glow of distant lava, but the fragile flame held in trembling hands, protected, nurtured, and understood. Fire was more than heat. It was a spark that ignited the human spirit, a symbol that reshaped existence. To control fire was to rewrite the contract between people and the wild world. Before fire, the night belonged to predators. Darkness pressed against the skin like a weight, and every sound carried menace. The tribes lived in shadows, their senses straining for the snap of a twig or the growl of a hunting cat. When flames were first drawn into a circle of stones, something extraordinary happened. Night itself was pushed back. The fire carved a sanctuary out of fear, a fragile island of safety in an ocean of unknown. For the first time, humans extended the boundary of day into the heart of night. The earliest fires may not have been made, but found, embers stolen from the aftermath of storms, carried carefully in bundles of bark or moss, kept alive with endless vigilance. Imagine a group of nomads huddled beneath a sheltering rock, watching as their one small flame flickered. They must have whispered prayers to keep it alive, tending it as though it were a living being. Fire was not just utility, it was spirit, a companion on the journey. Gradually, the tribes learned to create it themselves. The discovery must have seemed almost magical, the strike of stone against stone, or the patient grinding of wood until smoke curled upward and heat burst into flame. The person who first mastered this must have been regarded as touched by something divine. From that day onward, fire was no longer a gift borrowed from the world, it was something humanity could summon at will. The practical transformations were immense. With fire, meat could be cooked, making it safer and easier to digest. This fueled the human brain, granting energy for thought, creativity, and exploration. With fire, warmth could be stored against the cold of endless winters. With fire, tribes could wander into colder territories, expanding their range, surviving where once they would have perished. Fire was not just a tool, it was a passport into new lands. Fire also altered the social world. Around the flames, people gathered. Shadows danced on cave walls as stories were spoken. A hunt could be relived in words and gestures, turning individual memory into collective tradition. Fire extended the day, giving time not just for survival but for reflection, bonding, and imagination. It was by the fire that songs were first sung, myths first told, and knowledge first passed from one generation to the next. In this way, fire was the cradle of culture. But fire was never only benevolent. It held a dual nature, both savior and destroyer. A spark could leap from a careless ember and turn forests into infernos. Fire gave protection, but it also demanded respect. Perhaps this is why it entered mythology across the world as a sacred, dangerous force. Prometheus stole fire from the gods, the Maori tell of Maui, who snared it from the underworld. Such stories reflect a truth the first tribes must have felt, that to hold fire was to hold something divine, something almost forbidden. On the lost continent, fire reshaped landscapes as much as it reshaped people. Tribes used controlled burns to clear forests, flush animals, and renew grasslands. These acts were small at first, but over centuries, they transformed entire ecosystems. Human beings, tiny compared to mammoths and saber-toothed cats, became ecological shapers, not through strength, but through flame. Fire was the equalizer, granting frail creatures with stone tools the ability to influence vast territories. The symbolism of fire ran deep. To watch it flicker was to stare into life itself, the ceaseless motion, the transformation of matter into light and heat, the reminder that existence is fragile yet enduring. Perhaps, gazing into flames, the first humans contemplated the same questions we do now. What is life? What does it mean to burn brightly, to fade, to leave only smoke and ash? Fire was a mirror of their own mortality and a promise of their potential. Fire also gave humans mastery over time. Before its use, night was a pause, a suspension of activity. With fire, the rhythm of life expanded. Work could continue into darkness, journeys could stretch further, and communities could bond for longer hours. This new command over the cycle of day and night planted seeds of organization, ritual, and planning. Fire marked the birth of foresight. Consider too the emotional intimacy fire created. Around it, tribes huddled close. Heat spread from body to body, stories wove from mouth to ear, children dozed against parents' shoulders. It was at these firesides that humanity learned not only survival but belonging. To sit at the fire was to be part of the group, to be embraced by warmth and light. Exile from the fire meant cold, fear, and isolation. Thus, fire was not only energy, it was identity. There is something timeless in that image. Even today, we gather around campfires, candles, or hearths. We watch the flames with the same wonder as our ancestors. In every flicker, we carry an echo of the first fires of the lost continent. They are still with us, alive in our rituals, our celebrations, our sense of home. And yet, the first tribes must have also feared its loss. Imagine the terror of waking to find embers gone cold, the spark extinguished. To be without fire was to be cast back into the mercy of predators and darkness. Entire migrations may have been planned around keeping the flame alive, ensuring it did not falter. The fire keeper, the one entrusted with tending it, held a role as sacred as a priest. Fire demanded faithfulness. In this way, fire was not merely a discovery but a covenant. Humanity agreed to feed it, guard it, respect it, and in return, it gave warmth, light, and survival. The bond was reciprocal, a pact older than language. And so, when we speak of the first fires, we speak not only of technology but of awakening. Fire was the first tool that was also a symbol, the first invention that was also a story. It lit the path toward culture, society, and meaning. Without it, the lost continent would have remained dark and cold, its people forever small against the beasts and elements. With it, humanity stepped into its destiny. The flame still burns, though continents have shifted and beasts have vanished. Its light continues to fall on our faces, carrying with it the memory of those first sparks struck by trembling hands in a world both terrifying and beautiful. Fire is not only history. It is the thread that ties us still to the first tribes, the beacon that illuminates the long journey from then to now. If fire gave humanity warmth and protection, language gave them power over the unseen, the ability to share thought, to carry an idea from one mind into another. It was the invisible thread that bound people together more deeply than firelight ever could. On the lost continent, where survival depended on cooperation, the beginnings of language may have been the most critical invention of all. Without it, there could be no planning of hunts, no teaching of children, no transmission of memory. With it, the tribes were no longer scattered individuals, they became a collective intelligence. Long before words as we know them, communication lived in gestures, in the subtle tilt of a head or the tension of a hand. A raised palm could halt a movement, a pointed finger could signal danger in the trees. The body itself was the first dictionary. Imagine a group silently stalking prey across the open plain. No sound could be made, yet information had to flow. In such silence, the flicker of eyes, the arch of a brow, or the wave of a spear carried meaning more urgent than speech. But gestures alone were fragile. They vanished the moment they were made. Sound extended communication into the darkness, into distance, into time itself. Perhaps the first language was a series of cries, a warning call for predators, a different cry for prey sighted, a softer hum to soothe infants. Each sound was tied to survival, an audible map of the environment. Over generations, these calls became more complex, woven into patterns that could not only describe the present but hint at the unseen. Consider the leap from a warning cry to a sound that meant not only lion, but lion near the river. That was more than instinct, it was abstraction. It was the birth of symbols, the moment sound became thought. With symbols, humans could point not just to things but to ideas, to events not immediately visible, to dangers yet to come. This ability transformed the tribes into time travelers, able to prepare for what was not yet here. Language also shaped memory. A hunt retold in words became a lesson. Failure became instruction. Success became tradition. A father could tell a son how his own father once stalked a beast. Knowledge extended beyond the lifespan of individuals, traveling across generations. With language, the dead could still speak through the living. Memory gained permanence. Around the fires of the lost continent, these spoken memories likely grew into stories. At first, they were practical, warnings about rivers, maps of where fruit trees grew, instructions on building shelter. But soon, they became something more. The human mind, lit by words, began to weave imagination. The story of a hunt blurred into legend, the shapes of constellations became the faces of spirits. Language did not just describe the world, it re-enchanted it. The emotional power of words cannot be overstated. Imagine a child soothed by the rhythm of a mother's voice, even when the meaning was beyond comprehension. The sound alone carried safety, warmth, belonging. Words became music, weaving bonds within families and tribes. Just as fire gathered bodies around its warmth, language gathered minds within a shared horizon of meaning. But just as fire had its dangers, so too did words. A lie could spread as easily as a truth. Language could unite, but it could also divide. A single word could inspire trust or suspicion. Over time, dialects would emerge, separating groups who once shared common roots. What began as a tool of survival also planted the seeds of conflict. Yet, even in its conflicts, language proved its might. The ability to persuade, to negotiate, to command, these were powers unknown to beasts. The tongue became as sharp as the spear. We can imagine how fragile these early sounds must have been, shifting and reshaping with every generation. A child's mispronunciation might become tomorrow's accepted word. In this way, language evolved as a living organism, carried not in stone or fire, but in the air itself. Its transience was also its strength. It adapted, it flexed, it followed the tribe into every new landscape. The landscape of the lost continent too shaped its words. In the forests, sounds needed to be short and sharp, cutting through the density of leaves. On the open plains, calls could stretch long and low, echoing across distance. Even the rhythm of rivers and winds may have carved their patterns into human speech. Language was not separate from the land, it was an echo of it, shaped by the terrain and its demands. And so, the tribes became storytellers. They spoke to remember, they spoke to teach, they spoke to dream. In their speech, animals became characters, the sky became a canvas of gods, the earth itself became alive. Myths were not mere entertainment, they were maps of meaning, frameworks for survival. To speak of a spirit in the river was also to warn of its dangers. To tell of a giant in the mountains was also to remind children of the perils of wandering too far. Stories encoded knowledge in memory's most durable form, imagination. Language also carried something subtler, a sense of self. To say, I, was to distinguish the individual from the group. To say, we, was to knit them back together again. Words created identity, both personal and collective. Without them, the tribe was only a mass of bodies. With them, it became a community, a people, a culture. Even silence gained meaning once language was born. A pause after a sentence could carry weight, hesitation, or reverence. Silence around the fire might mean agreement, or grief, or awe. The very absence of words gained significance because words existed. In this way, language did not only create sound, it created depth. We are its inheritors still. Every word we speak today, every poem, every book, every whispered confession, is the distant descendant of those first cries and hums on the lost continent. We carry their breath in our own. When we speak, we echo them. When we write, we extend their voices across time. Language, like fire, was not just a tool of survival but a portal into something larger. It allowed humanity to transcend mere existence and to enter meaning. With words, they began not just to live but to ask why. With words, they began not just to survive but to dream of more. And so, on that lost continent, where the first tribes lived, language was as vital as food and shelter. It was their invisible fire, illuminating minds as flames illuminated caves. Together, fire and language gave birth to humanity as we know it, creatures not only of flesh and bone but of memory, imagination, and story. The world has changed, but the essence remains. When we speak to one another today, when we gather around firesides or write our thoughts into the ether, we are continuing the oldest of traditions. We are keeping alive the language of survival, the gift that made us more than mere animals, the inheritance that allowed us to become storytellers, dreamers, and thinkers. On the lost continent, survival was a daily negotiation with hunger. Every sunrise brought the same urgent question: would the tribe eat today, or would the day end in empty stomachs and fading strength? For the first tribes, hunting was more than sustenance. It was the crucible of courage, the stage where strategy, cooperation, and trust were tested. To hunt was to step between shadow and light, shadow, where death waited in the teeth of beasts, and light, where victory meant firelit feasts and survival secured for another night. The earliest hunters were not apex predators. Compared to the great beasts of their time, humans were fragile, slower than gazelles, weaker than lions, smaller than mammoths. Alone, they were prey. But together, guided by cunning and coordination, they reshaped the balance of power. The hunt was not merely physical, it was an art of patience and planning. Every movement, every signal, every breath mattered. Success was measured not only in kills but in lessons learned, in bonds forged under the shared tension of pursuit. Picture the scene: a group of hunters crouched at the edge of tall grass, watching the silhouettes of antelope grazing in the open plain. The air is heavy with silence, broken only by the rustle of wind. Eyes meet, hands flicker with gestures. Now, not yet, wait. Then, with sudden precision, the group fans out, driving the herd into a chosen direction, where others wait with spears. The kill is swift, brutal, yet deeply sacred. Blood spills, life ends, and with it, life for the tribe is preserved. But hunting was never only about food. It became a ritual, a performance of survival in which each role carried meaning. The trackers, reading the earth as though it were a book. The scouts, attuned to every sound of the forest. The spearbearers, ready to deliver the final blow. Even those who stayed behind, tending fires, watching children, were part of the hunt circle. Each successful kill was the work of many hands, many eyes, many hearts. To the tribes, the animals themselves were more than targets. They were beings of spirit, creatures whose strength and speed inspired awe. To kill such an animal was not a simple act of dominance. It was a dialogue with the wild. Some tribes may have whispered apologies to the fallen beast, acknowledging the life taken. Others may have painted its image on cave walls, immortalizing its spirit. In these acts, hunting crossed from necessity into reverence. The hunters were not only killers, they were participants in a cycle larger than themselves. The Lost Continent's landscapes amplified this drama. In the dense forests, hunts were tense, close-quarters encounters, where the snap of a twig could doom the attempt. In the open plains, hunts stretched across distance, demanding endurance more than speed. In the rivers and marshes, the prey could turn predator, crocodiles waiting beneath the surface, ready to strike. Each terrain reshaped the dance between human and animal, between survival and death. Fire and language, the twin gifts of humanity, elevated the hunt. By firelight, strategies were planned: how to circle the herd, where to drive the beasts, who would take the final strike. Around that same fire, stories of past hunts were retold, shaping memory into instruction. Language allowed the hunters to imagine success before it happened, to coordinate action with precision, to share in the triumph of victory and the grief of failure. The hunt was not random chaos, it was choreography. Yet failure was just as common as success. Spears missed, prey escaped, hunters were injured or killed. To risk the hunt was to risk everything. But with every failure came learning: how the wind carried scent, how the ground betrayed the weight of an animal, how to anticipate movement by studying posture. Over time, these lessons became collective wisdom, whispered from elder to child, until hunting was not merely an act but a tradition. The hunt also taught the tribes about themselves. In the pursuit of prey, they discovered patience, strategy, and sacrifice. To corner a beast required trust in one another, a willingness to take danger head-on for the good of the group. In this way, hunting was not only about feeding bodies, it was about forging identity. They were hunters because they had no choice, but they remained hunters because it shaped who they were. There was also a spiritual duality to hunting: the shadow and the light. The shadow was the danger, the blood, the violence of ending life. The light was the feast, the celebration, the joy of survival. Both were inseparable. To face the shadow was to earn the light. This rhythm became central to the human condition: that joy is born from risk, that life is sustained through confrontation with death. Over generations, the hunt gave rise to myths. Animals became symbols: the swift gazelle representing speed, the mighty bison embodying strength, the sly fox carrying cunning. These myths blurred the lines between human and animal, suggesting kinship rather than separation. To hunt was not to destroy but to join in the eternal cycle of predator and prey, of shadow and light. When we look at cave paintings from distant eras, herds of animals racing across stone walls, hunters with spears frozen mid-strike, we glimpse this ancient relationship. These are not mere records of food gathered. They are testimonies of reverence, fear, and awe. Each painted beast is both an enemy and a teacher, both nourishment and mystery. The hunters of the Lost Continent did not only secure meals for their people, they secured meaning. In the intensity of the chase, they discovered courage. In the quiet planning before dawn, they discovered unity. In the spilling of blood, they discovered reverence. And in the firelit feasts that followed, they discovered joy. Hunting was the theater where humanity rehearsed what it meant to be human. It demanded intelligence, cooperation, memory, imagination, and spirituality. It was a daily reminder that survival was not guaranteed, that existence itself was earned. To hunt was to confront the fragility of life, and in doing so, to reaffirm its value. Thus, on the lost continent, the tribes lived as hunters of shadow and light. Their lives were suspended between danger and triumph, fear and gratitude, death and survival. And in that fragile balance, humanity took shape. When the first tribes brought down their prey, the story did not end with the kill. The act of survival, repeated across countless generations, evolved into something far greater: ritual. Hunting became more than the pursuit of meat and hide. It became a theater of meaning, a dialogue with the invisible forces that governed life and death. For those who lived on the lost continent, every hunt was charged with symbolism, woven into the spiritual fabric of their world. Imagine a circle of hunters returning at dusk, dragging the weight of a slain bison. Before the tribe feasts, the animal is laid down near the fire. Elders approach, whispering words not of triumph, but of gratitude. A hand rests upon the animal's still body. The people know they have taken a life, and life is never free. To eat without acknowledgement would invite imbalance, a rupture in the delicate bond between humanity and the wilderness. Thus, rituals arose, gestures of humility that bridged the living and the dead. The earliest rituals were simple, instinctive acts. Some tribes touched their foreheads to the animal, offering a silent apology. Others smeared their faces with its blood, a visceral recognition that survival required sacrifice. Still others left bones arranged carefully on the ground, as though returning part of the creature to the earth. In time, these gestures crystallized into traditions, repeated generation after generation, carrying memory into continuity. Why were these rituals necessary? Because the hunt was never merely about food. It was a confrontation with mortality. When humans killed, they glimpsed their own fragility. The fallen beast was a mirror, strong, fast, and yet undone. The rituals allowed the tribe to process this tension. They provided a framework to hold both gratitude and grief, both necessity and reverence. Without them, the hunt would have been unbearable. In some tribes, before the hunt even began, there were ceremonies to call upon unseen powers. Fires were lit at dawn, smoke rising into pale skies like messages to the gods. Hunters painted their bodies with ochre or ash, marking themselves with symbols of animals they hoped to pursue. Songs were sung, not only to strengthen courage, but to summon guidance, to align human effort with the mysterious will of nature. Consider the silence before a great hunt: spears sharpened, nets woven, hearts pounding. The ritual was as much about focus as it was about faith. By singing, painting, and praying, the hunters transformed fear into readiness. They did not walk into danger as fragile individuals, but as vessels of something larger, as participants in a story written long before their time. The rituals extended beyond the hunt itself. When the kill was secured, feasts became sacred gatherings. Around the fire, stories of the chase were retold, but always with a tone of reverence. The animal was described not only as prey, but as teacher. Its strength, its cunning, its resistance became qualities admired and celebrated. Children listened, learning not just the techniques of hunting, but the values hidden within: patience, courage, respect. Thus, ritual became education, shaping identity as much as sustenance. On the lost continent, different landscapes birthed different traditions. In the forests, where prey seemed to vanish into shadows, tribes believed animals were spirits who could cloak themselves. Before hunts, shamans would burn herbs, asking the forest for permission. In the plains, where speed determined survival, hunters ran together in ritualized sprints, imitating gazelles and antelope, as though embodying the essence of their quarry. By mimicking the animal, they believed they could bridge the distance between human and beast. In some places, hunting rituals left permanent marks upon stone. Deep in caves, hunters painted animals, not as trophies, but as prayers. To draw the outline of a bison or horse was to capture its essence, to call it into the realm of vision before the chase began. These images were not idle decoration. They were living symbols, attempts to connect with forces beyond comprehension. When the flames of torches flickered across these painted walls, the beasts seemed to move, leaping and running in eternal cycles of pursuit. The rituals were also moments of unity. In the hunt itself, danger divided the tribe, some in pursuit, some waiting, some at home. But in ritual, all were gathered. The child listening, the elder chanting, the hunter smearing blood upon their skin, all participated in the same act of acknowledgement. Ritual dissolved the boundary between hunter and non-hunter, reminding everyone that survival was collective. Failure too had its rituals. When a hunt ended in loss, when the hunters returned empty-handed, or worse, with one fewer member among them, the tribe turned to ceremony for healing. Fires burned low, songs shifted to mourning tones, and offerings were left at sacred sites, beads, stones, fragments of bone. The tribe acknowledged not only the life taken by beasts, but the fragile line upon which they themselves lived. Ritual gave sorrow a place to rest, keeping despair from consuming the spirit of the group. In the long arc of human memory, hunting rituals became the foundation of myth. Animals were no longer only prey, they became symbols of cosmic truths. The bear was not merely dangerous, it was a guardian spirit. The stag was not merely swift, it was a messenger of renewal. In this way, ritual blurred into religion, and the hunt became a pathway to the sacred. Philosophically, these practices revealed something profound. Humans were not content with survival alone. They sought meaning. They could not kill without asking why. They could not eat without giving thanks. This hunger for significance, as much as the hunger for food, defined the human condition. Ritual was the bridge between necessity and mystery, a way of saying, we are part of this world, and yet we long to understand it. When we today uncover these remnants, the cave paintings, the ochre-stained bones, the patterned scratches upon stone, we are not merely looking at art. We are glimpsing the echoes of ritual. We are witnessing the first human attempts to make sense of existence. The rituals of the hunt remind us that survival was never only about blood and flesh. It was about connection, to one another, to the animals, to the land, and to the unseen. Thus, on the lost continent, every hunt began and ended with ritual. It began with prayer and ended with gratitude. It began with courage and ended with reverence. Through these ceremonies, the first tribes wove survival into story, story into myth, and myth into meaning. And in that weaving, humanity itself was shaped. Fire was the great transformer. More than stone tools, more than the sharpened spear, it was fire that shifted humanity from fragile wanderers to masters of survival. To hold fire was to hold the sun in miniature, to grasp lightning in the palm, to command a force both nurturing and terrifying. On the lost continent, where the first tribes faced cold nights, prowling beasts, and endless uncertainty, fire was not only warmth. It was sanctuary. It was the heartbeat of every camp, the invisible thread that bound people together. In the earliest times, fire was rare, a gift that came from the sky. Lightning struck a tree, and flames consumed its branches. For the tribes who first witnessed it, the sight was awe itself, a raw, roaring mystery that devoured and illuminated at once. To approach such a force was dangerous. To harness it, unthinkable. And yet, in time, the bold and the curious learned to carry embers, to feed them carefully with dried grass and bark, to keep them alive through the dark. Fire, once wild and uncontrollable, became companion. Around the hearth, life unfolded. Flames warded off predators whose eyes gleamed in the night. Sparks pushed back the terror of darkness, replacing fear with a circle of light. In its glow, humans found safety, not only from beasts but from the vast emptiness of the night sky. Fire shrank the cosmos into something intimate, a small island of certainty in an ocean of shadows. The hearth also changed the very body of humanity. Raw meat, once tough and riddled with danger, softened over flame. Cooking released nutrients otherwise hidden, expanding the range of foods that could sustain the tribe. Fire lengthened life, sharpened minds, and fueled population growth. It was not just warmth for the skin, but nourishment for the brain. With every roasted root and seared cut of flesh, the fire deepened its role as ally. But fire was never only practical. It carried a presence, a personality. The tribes treated it not merely as tool, but as spirit. Flames danced and flickered like living beings, consuming, breathing, even speaking in crackles. To feed the fire was to show respect. To neglect it was a sin, for an extinguished hearth could mean death. Fire demanded attention, and so it earned reverence. The sacred hearth became the center of community. Children gathered around it to hear stories, eyes wide as shadows leapt across cave walls. Elders passed down knowledge, their words punctuated by sparks rising into the night. Around the hearth, the tribe became more than scattered individuals. They became listeners, dreamers, a people bound by narrative and flame alike. In time, rituals grew around the fire. Some tribes placed offerings into the flames, bits of food, beads of bone, even strands of hair, as though feeding a divine guest. Others traced patterns in the ash, reading omens in the shifting remains. Fire became oracle as much as protector. Its changing colors, its sudden surges or collapses, were seen as messages from beyond. For nomadic groups, the challenge was carrying fire across the land. They learned to wrap glowing embers in dried moss, carried carefully in hollowed horns or shells, keeping the sacred spark alive from one camp to the next. To lose fire on a journey was catastrophe. The tribe would huddle in cold fear until lightning or friction restored what had been lost. Thus, fire was continuity itself, a thread of survival passed through every step of migration. The hearth was also where the line between life and death was honored. When a member of the tribe passed away, fire often played a role in farewell. Some groups placed the dead near flames, believing smoke carried the spirit upward. Others burned offerings for the departed, gifts to accompany them into unseen worlds. In these moments, the fire was not only warmth for the living, but passage for the dead. Philosophically, fire mirrored humanity's dual nature. It was creation and destruction, friend and enemy. It cooked food but also consumed forests. It brought warmth but could burn flesh in an instant. To live with fire was to live with paradox, to respect both its gifts and its dangers. This duality became embedded in myth. Fire was often imagined as stolen from the gods, a dangerous treasure entrusted to mortals. To hold fire was to hold responsibility. At night, when the tribe sat in silence, fire also became imagination's canvas. Flames twisted into shapes, beasts, faces, spirits, and shadows danced upon rock walls. Storytelling was born in these moments. Fire was stage, backdrop, and light all at once, giving voice to the unseen. As children stared into its glow, they did not merely watch fuel burn. They gazed into the first theater of the human mind. The lost continents' tribes came to see fire as a bridge. It connected earth and sky, flesh and spirit, present and eternal. In its rising smoke, they imagined prayers ascending. In its ashes, they saw the cycle of decay and rebirth. Fire was not simply a discovery, it was revelation. It reshaped survival, but it also reshaped meaning, offering humans their first glimpse of the sacred woven into the practical. When archaeologists uncover hearths today, blackened stones, layers of soot, traces of charred bone, they are not merely studying ancient kitchens. They are looking into the oldest sanctuaries, the first temples without walls. Each hearth was altar and shield, classroom and council hall. Fire was the axis around which early humanity turned. Thus, in the story of the lost continent, fire is more than flame. It is the beginning of community, of ritual, of imagination. It is the silent teacher, showing humanity that survival is never only about the body. It is also about belonging, meaning, and the mystery of forces both beautiful and dangerous. To master fire was to master both necessity and wonder. And in that mastery, the first tribes began to glimpse what it meant not only to live, but to live as humans. Deep beneath the earth, where the light of day could not reach, the first tribes began to leave behind something astonishing: images. The caves of the lost continent became more than shelters. They became canvases. On rough stone walls, humans painted their world into being. Bison, mammoth, aurochs, and deer took shape in ochre and charcoal. Hands were pressed against rock, outlined in pigment, a declaration that someone had been here, that someone had lived. The act was more than decoration. It was a conversation with eternity. When the tribes painted, they were speaking not to one another, but to something beyond themselves, to the land, the spirits, the unborn future. In a world without written language, the cave became the library, the archive of human imagination. Each brush of pigment, each carved line, was an attempt to anchor fleeting life into permanence. The process itself carried ritual weight. To create pigment, they ground minerals into fine powder, mixed with fat, blood, or water. This was alchemy, a transformation of earth into vision. Torches illuminated the walls, casting shadows that made painted animals appear to move, alive in the flickering light. The cave was not a gallery. It was theater, dream, and prayer combined. Why did they paint? Perhaps it was to teach, to show hunters how to stalk prey, to pass down knowledge of animals and their movements. Perhaps it was magic, a belief that by drawing the hunt, they could ensure its success. Or perhaps it was simply expression, the irresistible urge to create, to turn thought into form. Whatever the reason, painting was a leap into abstraction, a step that separated humanity from every other creature. The hands are perhaps the most haunting. Dozens of palms, outlined in red or black, pressed against stone as if reaching across time. Some are large, some small, evidence that children stood beside their elders, sharing in the act. To look at them now is to feel presence. It is as though the wall itself remembers touch, carrying the imprint of people long vanished. These handprints whisper, "We were here, we mattered, we belonged." But the caves were not open to all. Evidence suggests that many were deep, difficult to reach, hidden away from daily life. To enter was to step into another world. The descent itself was symbolic, from the surface of ordinary existence into the womb of the earth, a place of transformation. Those who painted were perhaps shamans, visionaries chosen to bridge the gap between tribe and cosmos. The animals painted were not random. They were creatures of power, abundance, and fear. Mammoths, towering like mountains. Bison, herds rumbling like thunder. Horses, swift as wind. In these depictions, animals were more than food. They were beings with spirit, kin to the people who painted them. By placing them on the walls, humans acknowledged both dependence and reverence. Philosophically, the cave art marked a turning point. Humanity began to live not only in the physical world, but in the symbolic one. Images allowed memory to stretch beyond the moment. A painted bison outlasted the hunt. A handprint outlasted the life that pressed it. The caves thus became the first temples of time, preserving fragments of human existence against the erosion of days. Some caves even contain patterns and symbols that defy simple explanation: spirals, dots, lattices. These were not depictions of animals or hunts, but abstractions, perhaps visions seen in trance states or representations of forces invisible. They remind us that art was never only about survival. It was about the unseen, the spiritual, the ineffable. In the flickering light of fire, the paintings took on life. Shadows danced across them, making animals seem to run, leap, or charge. For the first tribes, this must have felt like entering another realm, a place where the barrier between real and imagined dissolved. The cave was a portal, and painting was the key. Generations returned to the same caves, layering images upon images, building a chorus of voices across centuries. This continuity reveals something profound. The tribe saw itself as part of a lineage, a chain that stretched backward and forward through time. They painted not only for themselves, but for those who would come after. The caves also hint at the birth of storytelling. Imagine an elder pointing at the painted wall, narrating a hunt, a vision, a myth. The cave was not silent, it echoed with words, with teaching, with ritual chants. Art and language intertwined, reinforcing memory and meaning. Modern archaeologists often approach these caves with reverence, crawling through narrow passages to find chambers alive with images. When they emerge into vast painted halls, they describe a sense of awe, as though the walls still hum with intention. The pigments may be tens of thousands of years old, but they retain a vitality that bridges ages. Standing before them, we are forced to ask, what were these people telling us? That they loved beauty? That they feared the wild and sought to tame it in image? That they longed for permanence in a fleeting world? Perhaps all of these. The cave paintings are mirrors as much as messages, reflecting the timeless human urge to mark existence with meaning. On the lost continent, where life was fragile and unpredictable, painting was defiance. Against the flood of forgetting, against the erosion of time, the cave painters said, "Remember us. Remember our animals, our hands, our world." The walls became a memory, not of individuals, but of humanity itself. And so, the first artists were also the first philosophers. With pigment and stone, they asked the question still with us: who are we? What endures? How can we speak to the future? The caves answered in silence, yet the silence spoke volumes. Even now, when we gaze at those ancient walls, we do not simply see art. We see continuity, a bridge spanning tens of thousands of years. The same impulse that drove a child to press a painted hand upon rock is the impulse that drives us to write, to film, to build, to create. The cave painters began a conversation that has never ended. In those subterranean chambers, surrounded by flickering shadows and echoes of breath, humanity discovered not only how to survive, but how to mean. And in meaning, we became human. On the lost continent, survival demanded cooperation. The hunt was not only about food, it was about identity, ritual, and unity. To step into the hunt was to step into a theater of life and death, where every movement mattered and every mistake could cost lives. The great hunt was the heartbeat of the tribe. Imagine the first light of dawn spilling across endless plains. The air is cold, heavy with dew. The hunters rise silently, carrying spears tipped with sharpened stone, some hardened by fire. Bows are rare, not yet perfected, but spears and atlatls extend their reach. Each weapon is more than a tool, it is a lifeline, an extension of will. Around them, the world stirs. Mammoths shake frost from their fur, horses graze in wary herds, and reindeer shift like rivers of antlers. The hunters move as one. Each role is vital. Some circle wide to drive animals toward waiting spearmen. Others lay in ambush, hidden in brush or behind stones. The youngest watch closely, learning by observing, for one day they too will join. The hunt is both school and battlefield, where skill is proven and bonds are forged. Prey is chosen with care. Too weak, and the meat may be scarce. Too strong, and the hunters risk death. The decision reflects wisdom passed down from countless hunts before. Perhaps today it is a bison, massive, dangerous, yet essential. One bison could feed the tribe for weeks, providing meat, hide, sinew, and bone. To bring one down was both victory and sacrifice. The chase begins. Shouts, stones, and fire drive the herd into panic. Dust rises in clouds as hooves thunder across the earth. The hunters run, their breaths quick, their feet striking rhythm in unison. Spears flash in the sun, glinting like lightning. The herd surges forward, but slowly the trap closes. Some animals escape, but one is isolated, tired, cut off, doomed. The moment of the kill is tense. Hunters encircle, spears raised. The bison charges, eyes wild, muscles rippling with rage and terror. A spear strikes deep, then another. The animal stumbles, bellows, and falls. Silence follows, broken only by heavy breathing and the settling dust. For a heartbeat, the hunters stare at the fallen creature with awe. Victory is theirs, but it carries weight. A life has been taken. Ritual follows. The hunters place hands upon the animal, offering thanks, perhaps a whispered prayer. Blood is not wasted, nor hide, nor bone. Every part of the creature will serve. Meat will feed the tribe, sinew will bind tools, hide will clothe and shelter. The hunt is not just killing, it is transformation, the turning of animal into human survival. Children rush forward, wide-eyed, watching as the elders carve with flint blades. They learn where sinew lies, how bones break, how hide peels clean. The act of butchering is itself a lesson, a passage into knowledge that binds tribe to land. Fire crackles as meat roasts, and the scent fills the air. Tonight there will be feasting. Tonight there will be stories told by firelight, of the hunt, of bravery, of near misses. But not all hunts end in triumph. Sometimes the prey turns hunter. A mammoth, enraged and cornered, might crush men beneath its weight. A wounded bison might gore a hunter before falling. Death is always near. The great hunt is a gamble, one that requires courage and trust. When hunters fall, their names are remembered, their sacrifice woven into the fabric of the tribe. The hunt is also performance. Painted faces, chants, and rhythmic movements may have preceded the chase. Some tribes danced hunts before enacting them, rehearsing in ritual what they would soon attempt in flesh. These dances were not mere practice, they were magic, binding imagination and reality, summoning strength and focus. In this way, the great hunt was both practical and spiritual, a living bridge between survival and belief. Philosophically, the hunt reveals humanity's place in the chain of being. Hunters stood between predator and prey, both fragile and fierce. They were not masters of the land, but participants in its cycle. The death of the animal mirrored their own mortality, a reminder that all lives ended, that survival was always temporary. To hunt was to acknowledge this truth, even as they fought against it. When the feast begins, the tribe gathers around the fire. The meat is shared, not hoarded, for survival depends on generosity. Elders receive the choicest cuts, children the tender morsels, hunters their reward. Eating together is more than nourishment. It is communion, the binding of tribe into one body. The fire glows, sparks rise into the night, and voices carry the story of the hunt. Somewhere in the shadows, an elder perhaps points toward the painted cave walls, showing how today's hunt will join the lineage of hunts before. Stories are etched not only in pigment, but in memory, carried in the minds of children who will one day repeat them. The great hunt is not just an act, but a rhythm, a tradition echoing across generations. And so, the great hunt is remembered not as mere necessity, but as ceremony, an act that affirmed life, even as it took it. It united tribe, land, animal, and spirit in a single cycle. In the lost continent, amid its vast plains and towering beasts, the hunt was the axis upon which existence turned. As the last light of day fades, the tribe gathers around the fire. The air cools quickly on the lost continent, and the breath of night drifts across the plains. Shadows lengthen, stars begin to pierce the darkening sky, and the first sparks rise from the flames. Fire is more than warmth. It is protection, memory, and mystery, a fragile miracle guarded at all costs. The fire crackles, its dance alive, unpredictable yet constant. For early humans, fire was both gift and danger. It could warm, cook, and ward off predators, but it could also destroy if left untended. To keep the fire burning was to keep the tribe alive. Each flame was part of a lineage stretching back to the first embers ever tamed. The fire was never truly born and never allowed to die. It was carried in embers, passed from hand to hand, from place to place, as if it were itself a living ancestor. Around the fire, the hunters return from the great chase. Their bodies ache, their muscles tremble, but the glow eases the weight of exhaustion. Children press close to mothers, eyes wide with hunger and wonder. The smell of roasted meat fills the air, heavy and sweet, mingling with wood smoke. Soon the tribe will feast. Yet the fire is not only about food. It is a stage, a gathering place where stories take shape. Darkness surrounds them. Beyond the circle of light, the world is unknown. Predators lurk in the distance, wolves or lions watching with cautious eyes. But they dare not cross the fire's boundary. For the first time, humans hold power over the night. The fire makes them sovereign, masters of a space otherwise claimed by beasts. Its glow is both shield and sanctuary, a promise that the tribe can face the darkness together. The flames also change what can be seen. Faces are painted in red and gold, features shifting with every flicker. Fire makes people appear larger, stranger, more mysterious. It allows imagination to bloom, creating shadows that twist into forms of animals, ancestors, or spirits. To look into the fire is to look into another world, a world both real and symbolic. Here, stories begin. Elders raise their voices, deep and steady, carrying memories of the hunt, of the land, of the tribe's past. Children lean forward, caught in the rhythm. The firelight reflects in their eyes, making them glow like mirrors of the flames themselves. Stories are not merely entertainment. They are instruction, warning, and identity. Through them, each person learns who they are and what binds them to those who came before. The stories often blur fact and myth. The great bison becomes not just an animal, but a spirit guardian. The hunt transforms into a cosmic struggle, where humans join the endless cycle of life and death. Heroes emerge, tricksters too, and lessons are carved into memory through words. The fire gives these stories their stage, its crackling serving as drumbeat, its shadows as theater. Songs may rise as well, chants in rhythm with clapping hands or the beat of a stone on wood. The tribe's voices weave together, rising and falling like waves. In those moments, language is not just communication but music, binding every voice into one. Fire is not silent. It is chorus, partner, and witness to this shared creation of culture. But fire is more than symbol. It is practical salvation. It cooks meat, softening fibers, releasing nourishment. Raw flesh gives way to warmth and flavor, making survival easier and safer. Disease is burned away in the heat, and the body grows stronger. Firelight also extends the day. Instead of being bound by sunset, the tribe claims extra hours, carving a longer life into the short span of daylight. Night without fire is vulnerability. Cold gnaws at bones, predators creep closer, and fear grips the heart. Night with fire is transformation. It allows laughter, conversation, and planning for tomorrow. It is the difference between enduring and living. For this reason, someone is always tasked with tending the flame. Even as the tribe sleeps, one pair of eyes stays awake, feeding branches and watching embers. To let the fire die is unthinkable. To lose it is to step backward into terror. Philosophically, fire is one of humanity's first companions, a true partnership. It is not owned, only borrowed. It teaches both humility and mastery. Humans cannot create fire from nothing without skill, but once captured, they can sustain it, shaping it to their needs. This relationship mirrors the balance of existence. Survival requires cooperation with forces greater than oneself. As the night deepens, the stars appear in countless numbers. Some tribe members look upward, wondering, what are they? Ancestors, fires of the sky, or eyes of spirits? Fire on the ground mirrors fire in the heavens, connecting earth to cosmos. For a moment, under the blanket of night, the tribe sits between two infinities, the flickering flames at their feet and the eternal constellations above. Children grow drowsy, their heads resting against mother's shoulders, their dreams shaped by firelight stories. Hunters sharpen tools in silence, their minds already drifting toward the challenges of dawn. Elders sit closest to the flames, as though they too are embers nearing the end of their glow. Fire unites all generations in one circle, one light against the dark. Eventually, silence settles. The tribe sleeps, wrapped in hides, curled near the warmth. The fire burns lower, embers pulsing like a slow heartbeat. It will last until morning, carrying the tribe safely through the dangers of night. Tomorrow, the hunt and the journey will begin again. But tonight, fire has given them shelter, story, and spirit. On the lost continent, fire was not simply discovered. It was revered, woven into the rhythm of existence. To sit by the fire was to step out of chaos and into meaning. It was the first stage, the first temple, the first reminder that humans could shape not only their world but also their place within it. And so, the night passes, lit by fire, guarded by flame, remembered in warmth. Belief does not begin with temples or written scripture. It begins with questions, with the human need to explain what lies beyond the visible, to make sense of the mysteries that shape survival. On the lost continent, where storms tore across the plains, where predators emerged from shadows, and where death arrived without warning, humans began to search for patterns. They sought reasons behind chaos, voices within silence, and meaning within the cycles of life and death. Out of this search, the first seeds of belief took root. Around the fire, stories transformed into something more than memory. They became explanations of the unknown. A lightning strike splitting a tree became the act of a sky spirit. The sudden death of a hunter was not random, but the work of an unseen force. The birth of a child was not merely chance, but a blessing from ancestors who walked unseen in the air. These interpretations gave structure to fear. They allowed the tribe to weave chaos into narrative, creating an order that made life less overwhelming. The first rituals were simple. Stones arranged in circles. Bones placed carefully beside a body. Hands raised to the sky in silent gestures. These acts were not yet religion, as we would define it, but they carried intent. They expressed gratitude, plea, or reverence. Even without words for gods, humans sensed the presence of something larger than themselves, a presence that demanded recognition. Burial practices reveal much of this awakening. On the lost continent, some bodies were not left to rot but placed with care, covered with earth or stone. Sometimes, objects were left beside them, tools, shells, pigments. Such offerings suggest the belief that life continued after death in some form. To bury with care was to admit that the dead were not gone, but traveling elsewhere. The tribe could not follow, yet they could send gifts for the journey. This was the dawn of afterlife belief, a first glimpse into metaphysical imagination. Art, too, became entwined with belief. Cave walls painted with animals were more than decoration. They may have been prayers, attempts to summon herds, to honor spirits, or to connect with forces hidden in the stone itself. A bison painted on rock was not only an image but also a bridge between worlds. The act of painting became ritual, pigment standing in for blood, brushstroke echoing chant. These artworks, left in darkness, spoke to the unseen as much as to the living. The natural world fed this rise of belief. The sun, constant yet fleeting, became a source of awe. Its daily disappearance could feel like death, and its return like resurrection. The moon, changing form night after night, was another mystery, a rhythm that seemed alive, an eye watching over the tribe. Animals, too, carried sacred weight. The lion was strength, the serpent transformation, the bird freedom. Each creature held qualities beyond its flesh, symbols that could be invoked in story and ritual. Fear was a teacher. When storms raged, humans crouched in caves, trembling at thunder. Yet even in fear, imagination worked. Perhaps thunder was a voice, rain a blessing, wind the breath of a spirit. These explanations softened terror. They transformed the indifferent forces of nature into beings with intention, beings who could be honored, appeased, or respected. Belief was, in many ways, a dialogue with fear, a way to live with it rather than be destroyed by it. But belief was also hope. When food was scarce, rituals might be performed to call the herds. When illness struck, chants or markings could be made to summon healing. Even if the acts had no material effect, they bound the tribe together. Ritual created unity. Everyone could participate, clapping, singing, painting, or carrying offerings. Belief was not only about survival of the body but also survival of the group, a social glue that kept people moving forward as one. Symbols emerged, circles, spirals, handprints. A hand pressed against rock was more than identity, it was a statement. I am here. I exist. I am part of something beyond myself. These marks outlasted the maker, bridging generations. They became early scripture, written not on paper but in pigment, declaring the continuity of life, belief, and presence. Philosophically, this rise of belief reflects a deep truth. Humans cannot live in a world of randomness. We search for cause, connection, and meaning. Belief offered the first framework for this quest. It turned accident into story, loss into transition, and survival into destiny. Without it, the tribe might have been fractured by fear. With it, they became participants in a greater narrative, one where they were not merely prey in the wild, but chosen actors in a cosmic drama. As centuries passed, these early sparks of belief grew more elaborate. Rituals became more structured. Roles emerged: elders who carried sacred stories, healers who worked with herbs and chants, hunters who performed dances before the chase. What began as instinctual gestures evolved into tradition. Belief was no longer only personal, but collective, carried across generations like fire itself. In this way, belief mirrored the firelight. Just as flames pushed back darkness, belief pushed back uncertainty. It gave shape to the invisible and warmth to the unknown. It made humans feel less alone in a vast, uncaring wilderness. It connected them to ancestors, animals, and forces they could not see but deeply sensed. As the tribe slept beneath the stars, their dreams were filled with spirits, omens, and myths. The line between waking and dreaming blurred, creating a cycle where visions shaped rituals and rituals shaped visions. For the first time, humans lived in two worlds, the physical and the imagined, the material and the spiritual. That duality became the foundation of human culture, guiding choices, inspiring courage, and giving birth to the first philosophies of existence. On the lost continent, belief rose quietly but powerfully. It was not written, not formalized, yet it guided every gesture, from the way a body was buried to the way a story was told. Belief was not about certainty. It was about wonder, about asking questions, about stepping into the unknown with reverence. And in that wonder, humanity began to glimpse its future, a species not only surviving but seeking meaning beyond survival itself. Migration is not only a physical journey across landscapes. It is a journey of memory, of identity, carried from one horizon to another. For the tribes of the lost continent, movement was life. To stay too long in one place meant exhausting resources, inviting scarcity, and facing the wrath of changing climates. The rivers shifted, the forests burned, the herds wandered, and so too did humanity. Their feet pressed paths into soil, paths that would later become the invisible arteries of culture and history. The tribes moved in small bands, never so many that the land could not sustain them, yet never so few that they risked vanishing into the jaws of predators. They followed the seasons, the migrations of animals, the ripening of fruits, the blooming of plants. Their rhythm was not fixed but adaptive, a dance with the changing earth. They carried fire in smoldering bundles of wood and ash, carefully preserved, for to lose fire was to lose warmth, safety, and light. With them, they carried memory. Memory was not written but spoken, sung, painted, and performed. Each campfire was a classroom, where the young listened to the old. Each trail carried the weight of stories, which plants healed and which poisoned, which valleys offered water and which concealed danger. Memory was their library, preserved not in pages but in minds. Forgetting could mean death, remembering could mean survival. In this way, knowledge was a communal treasure, passed along like the flame itself. Migration tested memory. To move across new lands meant encountering unknown rivers, cliffs, and storms. Yet the tribe's memory stretched to hold it all. They mapped the land with stories. A crooked tree might mark the way to a fertile meadow. A cliff shaped like a lion's head might warn of dangerous winds. Geography became myth, and myth became survival. By weaving the land into narrative, they ensured that even children, years later, would recognize the signs that guided their people. But migration was not only necessity, it was also curiosity. The horizon beckoned with mystery. What lay beyond the mountain ridges, beyond the endless plains, beyond the rivers that seemed to flow into the sky? To move forward was to step into the unknown, and humans were compelled to do so, not just to survive, but to discover. Curiosity was as much a fire as the one they carried in bundles, fragile yet luminous, capable of reshaping destiny. The act of leaving carried emotional weight. To abandon a familiar camp, to leave behind the graves of loved ones, was painful. Yet migration transformed grief into continuity. The departed were not left behind but remembered in songs, gestures, and rituals carried onward. Memory was portable. A story could make the dead walk again. A dance could recall the laughter of a lost child. Thus, migration did not erase the past, it preserved it, spreading the essence of the tribe across greater distances than their feet alone could carry. The children were the vessels of this memory. They were taught stories not only of survival but of identity, who they were, where they came from, what spirits protected them. Each new camp became a place where memory was rehearsed and renewed. Without this, migration would have dissolved the tribe into fragments. With it, they became a people united by shared origin and shared dream. The landscape changed, but the inner world of the tribe endured. Philosophically, migration reveals a paradox. To preserve themselves, humans had to move, yet to remain themselves, they had to carry continuity. This balance between change and permanence became the foundation of culture. Too much change and identity dissolved, too much permanence and survival faltered. The tribe lived between these poles, constantly negotiating what to carry and what to leave behind. Migration also brought encounters. Other tribes, shaped by different valleys and forests, appeared on the horizon. Sometimes, these meetings led to conflict, competition over water, land, or herds. But at other times, they led to exchange. Tools, pigments, songs, and even individuals could move from one group to another. Ideas traveled alongside bodies, slowly shaping a wider network of knowledge across the lost continent. Humanity was not isolated in pockets but a web, tenuous yet growing stronger with each crossing. Memory itself was reshaped by migration. When stories moved to new landscapes, they adapted. A myth born in one valley might take new form when told beneath different stars. A ritual might acquire new meaning when performed in a new forest. Migration was thus both a carrier of tradition and a spark of innovation. It ensured continuity but also allowed transformation. The tribe's memory was not static but living, breathing, evolving. Art reflected this. Rock paintings appeared not only in caves where people settled but also along migration routes, left like signposts for those who followed. A handprint on a stone face was both declaration and invitation. We were here. You are not alone. Such marks turned migration paths into sacred trails, weaving memory directly into the earth. For those who came after, these markings were reminders that movement itself was part of identity. Migration also shaped time. Life was measured not by years but by journeys, the winter spent by the river, the spring in the meadow, the summer across the mountains. Memory itself became seasonal. Stories were attached to migration so that when a tribe returned to a place, they returned also to its memories. The land became layered, each visit adding new depth until geography and history merged into one. Spiritually, migration expanded belief. As humans entered new environments, they encountered new forces, rivers with different currents, skies with unfamiliar constellations, animals never seen before. Each demanded interpretation, reverence, or fear. Belief grew wider, incorporating new spirits, myths, and symbols. In this way, migration was not just physical but metaphysical. The tribe's inner universe expanded with each step. For the individuals, migration was both hardship and wonder. The feet blistered, the stomachs often emptied, the bodies ached. Yet the eyes opened to new beauty, sunsets over mountains never seen, rivers gleaming like mirrors, skies filled with constellations unimagined. Migration demanded suffering, but it also offered awe. The balance between the two gave life a rhythm of trial and reward, pain and revelation. In hindsight, migration was humanity's first great destiny. It ensured not only survival on the lost continent but also the eventual spread across the world. Each step carried the potential of future civilizations, future languages, future dreams. The path of migration was the path of becoming, a journey that would never truly end, even thousands of years later. At night, when the tribe camped beneath unfamiliar stars, they told stories of the places they had left. Around the fire, the children learned not to fear the unknown but to honor it. They learned that memory was not lost when the land changed, but carried within them, waiting to be spoken again. Migration and memory became inseparable, two halves of the same truth. To move forward, they had to remember. To remember, they had to move forward. Thus, the lost continent was crisscrossed not only with trails of footsteps but with trails of memory, invisible yet enduring. Every hill and valley bore echoes of laughter, grief, and song. The continent itself became a living archive, its soil infused with the weight of stories carried across centuries. In walking, the tribes wrote themselves into the earth, ensuring that even if they vanished, their memory would remain, lingering like footprints in stone. Every migration brought the tribes closer to horizons they had never crossed before. With each step, the familiar faded, and the unknown emerged. Forests grew darker, rivers ran in unfamiliar directions, mountains rose like barriers against the sky. The world was vast, and humanity had only begun to map it with memory and myth. Each encounter with the unfamiliar was a test, forcing the tribe to expand not only their physical endurance but also their imagination. The animals were often the first unknowns. Some were familiar in shape, yet larger, more powerful, almost otherworldly. The great aurochs towered like living walls of muscle, their horns sweeping wide enough to pierce the air itself. Massive birds, taller than men, strode across plains, their footsteps echoing like drums of the earth. In rivers, shadows moved, crocodiles, longer than 10 men, lurking in silence, ready to explode into violence. To the tribes, these creatures were not merely animals but spirits embodied. Their presence demanded reverence, fear, and story. Fire was their shield against such dangers, but not always enough. At night, when the fires dimmed, the forest seemed alive with glowing eyes, with roars that shivered through bones. These were encounters not only with predators, but with the limits of human courage. To face the unknown was to acknowledge fragility, to know that life balanced on a thin edge. Yet it was precisely this awareness that sharpened memory, that deepened ritual, that made survival an art. Sometimes, the unknown was not monstrous but awe-inspiring. Towering waterfalls thundered with a power so immense that the ground shook. Caves stretched endlessly into darkness, their walls glittering with crystals that reflected firelight like 1,000 stars trapped underground. Storms ripped across plains with lightning so fierce it illuminated entire valleys for a heartbeat. Such moments filled the tribes not only with fear but with wonder. The unknown could kill, but it could also enchant, inviting reverence rather than avoidance. In these encounters, belief systems evolved. Spirits, once bound to rivers and trees, grew larger, encompassing storms, mountains, and creatures of immense scale. The unknown was not random, it was purposeful, intentional, a language spoken by the earth itself. Every roar of thunder became a warning, every strange animal a messenger. For the tribes, to ignore these signs was to risk disaster. Thus, mythology became survival, a way to interpret the unknown, to place chaos into a framework that made sense. But not all encounters with the unknown were external. Some were inward, born in the silence of the night when sleep blurred the boundary between waking and dream. In visions, hunters saw animals they had never met, landscapes they had never crossed. Were these mere dreams or glimpses of what lay ahead? The tribes treated them as omens. A vision could shape decisions, to avoid a valley, to follow a river, to prepare for an enemy. The unknown lived both in the land and in the mind, a dual realm of discovery and uncertainty. Meeting other tribes was another kind of unknown, unpredictable, dangerous, yet transformative. At first sight, strangers might appear as threats, different languages, different faces, different rituals. Fear often guided the first reactions. Yet curiosity, too, was present. What tools did they carry? What animals did they follow? Sometimes, the encounters ended in conflict, blood staining the soil. But at other times, they ended in exchange. Stone tools traded for pigments, songs shared across campfires. Each meeting widened the world, teaching that the unknown was not always an enemy, but a mirror reflecting possibilities. The unknown also tested morality. When faced with strange animals, should they kill or revere? When meeting strangers, should they attack or embrace? Survival demanded caution, yet humanity's curiosity demanded trust. The tribes navigated this tension with rituals, stories, and negotiation. Slowly, rules of encounter emerged, signals of peace, offerings to spirits, ceremonies of respect. Out of the unknown, the first patterns of ethics began to form, guiding behavior in a world of uncertainty. Fear was constant, but so was resilience. The tribe's children grew up in an environment where the unknown was not hidden but acknowledged. They learned that fear was not weakness, but wisdom. They learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to step forward despite it. In this way, encounters with the unknown forged character, shaping humanity into explorers, dreamers, and survivors. Over generations, these encounters accumulated into memory. A tribe that once feared a predator learned how to track, trap, and eventually master it. A river once considered dangerous became a lifeline of fish and transport. A mountain once seen as impenetrable became a sacred landmark. The unknown never disappeared, it simply shifted, evolving with each horizon crossed. Humanity's gift was not to eliminate the unknown, but to transform it into knowledge. Still, mystery remained. Even as tools improved, as fire grew brighter, as stories expanded, there were always new frontiers. The earth was too vast, too complex, to ever be fully known. And perhaps this was the deeper lesson. The unknown was not an obstacle to be conquered, but a companion to be embraced. It was the spark that pushed the tribes forward, that kept them searching, wondering, moving. By the time the tribes had spread across the lost continent, their encounters with the unknown had become the foundation of identity. They were no longer merely survivors, but interpreters of a vast and mysterious world. Each generation inherited not only tools and fire, but a relationship with uncertainty. The unknown was the teacher, the adversary, and the muse. To walk into it was to walk into the heart of existence itself. The lost continent was never a single stage for one tribe alone. It was vast, with valleys that stretched for weeks of walking, rivers that wound endlessly, and forests that swallowed horizons. Within this landscape, human groups multiplied, separated by distance but linked by the instinct to wander. Over generations, the land became a patchwork of clans, each with its own songs, its own rituals, its own way of surviving. Yet slowly, inevitably, invisible threads began to weave them together. The first threads were of necessity. Tribes following the same herds or fishing in the same rivers would cross paths. At first, these meetings often meant tension. Strangers were unpredictable, they carried weapons, spoke in strange tongues, and looked upon the land as their own. But necessity softened fear. When hunger pressed too heavily, or when resources ran low, curiosity overpowered caution. A hand signal here, a cautious offering there, and soon the beginnings of exchange. A sharp blade chipped from a rare stone, a bundle of dried meat, a piece of ochre pigment for painting skin and cave walls. Trade was not just material. Alongside objects traveled ideas, gestures, songs. A story told around one fire could, within a few generations, be spoken in valleys hundreds of miles away. In this way, myth became a vehicle of connection. Spirits once known only to one clan began to be worshipped by others, adapted and reshaped but recognizable. A hunter's tale of a great beast could inspire caution in distant places, where the animal itself never roamed. The web of tribes was woven not only through hands exchanging goods, but through tongues carrying memory. Yet not all exchanges were peaceful. Conflict was as much a part of this web as alliance. When one tribe trespassed too far into another's hunting grounds, blood might be spilled. A river's fish, once plentiful, could become a contested resource. Battles were fought not with armies but with small bands of hunters, each side desperate to prove strength. But even war left connections. Captives were sometimes absorbed into new tribes, carrying with them knowledge of tools, songs, and gods. Violence fractured, but it also fused, shaping bonds that were as complex as the land itself. Marriage was another thread, perhaps the most enduring. When one tribe gave a daughter or son to another, the bond went deeper than trade. Bloodlines crossed, and kinship extended across valleys and rivers. Over time, these marriages built vast networks of obligation and trust. A child born of two tribes was not simply a member of one family but a living bridge between worlds. Such unions ensured peace where conflict once threatened, creating alliances that outlasted single lifetimes. The web also extended through migration. Tribes that moved far from their homelands carried with them traces of their origin, a word in their language, a way of making fire, a ritual performed at the full moon. Even when distances grew vast, echoes of shared ancestry remained. This is why, across the lost continent, similar cave paintings appear, spirals, animals, human figures with outstretched arms. Though separated by valleys and rivers, the tribes were tied by invisible threads of memory. Gatherings became moments where the web grew visible. Once or twice a year, tribes might converge on sacred sites, a waterfall considered a spirit's dwelling, a vast plain where herds gathered, or a cave whose walls were already inscribed with stories. These gatherings were both practical and mystical. Food was exchanged, marriages arranged, disputes settled. But alongside survival, art flourished. Songs grew louder, painted bodies danced in rhythm, stories were retold with the force of many voices. Such gatherings transformed the isolation of survival into the feeling of belonging to something greater. The web was not static but constantly shifting. Tribes rose and fell, alliances broke, languages diverged. A tool once prized might be forgotten when a better method emerged. Myths splintered into variations, each tribe claiming their own version of a tale. Yet despite these differences, the web endured because it was woven from the shared experience of being human in a vast, unpredictable world. Every tribe, no matter how distant, knew hunger, loss, wonder, and hope. These were the fibers of connection. Philosophically, the web revealed something profound. To live as a tribe was to exist not as isolated beings, but as part of a larger whole. Survival was never truly solitary, it was always relational. Even enemies defined one's identity, pushing tribes to sharpen their tools, their stories, their courage. The existence of others, strangers, allies, rivals, gave meaning to one's own life. To weave into the web was to acknowledge that humanity was not just an individual struggle, but a collective journey. Children grew up hearing stories not only of their own ancestors but of neighboring tribes. They learned to recognize the signs of strangers, the shape of a spearhead, the markings painted on skin, the rhythm of a song. These distinctions mattered, but so did the awareness that beyond difference lay connection. The child understood that somewhere across the valley, another child sat by another fire, learning songs, fearing storms, dreaming of hunts. The web was not only political or material, it was emotional, a recognition that others too shared the mystery of being alive. Over centuries, this web became the silent foundation of culture. The sharing of pigments and stories evolved into shared symbols, early forms of art and language. The giving of daughters and sons became the root of kinship systems. Even conflict, as devastating as it could be, pushed tribes to innovate, adapt, and grow. The web was fragile, constantly threatened by scarcity and fear, but it was also enduring. It carried humanity across the lost continent, ensuring that no tribe truly walked alone. In the end, the web of tribes was more than survival. It was a reflection of humanity's deepest instinct, to connect, to remember, to share. Each tribe was a strand, and together they wove a net strong enough to carry their species through fire, storm, and time itself. Without this web, the continent would have been nothing but silence. With it, the land pulsed with voices, with echoes, with the beginnings of civilization. The lost continent was never still. Even in its most ancient days, the land pulsed with change. Warm rains turned dry plains into seas of grass. Cold winds swept down from the mountains, freezing rivers into silence. Fires lit by lightning storms raged across forests, clearing space for new growth. For the tribes who walked this shifting world, survival meant more than strength or courage. It meant learning the language of seasons, a language written in wind, water, and stars. At first, the seasons were felt as sudden trials. A tribe that flourished in summer's abundance could be broken by winter's hunger. Crops of wild plants vanished beneath snow. Rivers froze, cutting off fish. Herds migrated, leaving empty valleys behind. The early generation suffered these turns as mysteries, punishments from unseen spirits perhaps, or the will of the sky. Yet with suffering came memory, and with memory, understanding. Over time, patterns revealed themselves. The same stars rose before the rains came. Certain birds returned just as plants ripened. The first frost always followed the setting of a particular constellation. These signs became more than curiosities, they were guides. The tribes began to carry this knowledge in their stories, passing it from elders to children. To know when to move, when to hunt, when to prepare, this was wisdom as vital as fire itself. The seasons shaped not only survival but imagination. Winter was not just cold, it was a spirit of silence, a shadow that tested the tribe's endurance. Spring was renewal, the rebirth of plants and animals, a time of joy. Summer was abundance, the generosity of the land. Autumn was preparation, a reminder of cycles ending. Each turn of the year became a chapter in a larger story, one that tribes carried in their rituals. Rituals grew from necessity. Before winter, food was dried and stored, with chants to ward off hunger. At the first signs of spring, fires were lit to call forth fertility in plants and animals. During summer's height, dances celebrated life's abundance. And in autumn, ceremonies of gratitude honored the land for its gifts. These rituals gave shape to the formless, transforming fear into reverence. The seasons were no longer enemies but companions, forces that guided life's rhythm. Migration itself became seasonal. Herds of great beasts moved along ancient paths, and the tribes followed. Rivers swelled and shrank with rains, dictating when fishing grounds would be fruitful. Even the insects marked the time. When swarms of locusts or clouds of fireflies appeared, the people knew what change was coming. To survive was to walk with the seasons, never ahead, never behind. The turning of seasons also wove itself into art. Cave walls bore images not only of animals but of cycles, spirals representing the sun's path, handprints painted in layers of color, perhaps marking years. Songs carried the memory of harsh winters and fertile springs. Children grew up listening to tales where heroes wrestled the spirit of frost or courted the goddess of summer. Through these creations, the people gave voice to the invisible forces that ruled their lives. Philosophically, the seasons taught the tribes humility. They reminded humans that they were not masters of the land but participants in its eternal dance. No matter how skilled the hunter, no matter how clever the toolmaker, the tribe still bowed before the return of cold or the arrival of rain. The seasons made existence cyclical rather than linear. Birth, death, decay, and renewal, these were not singular events but eternal returns. To live was to move in circles, just as the stars did above. Children were taught to look for signs in the smallest details, the angle of the sun, the smell of the wind, the first call of migrating birds. Such knowledge was treasured more than possessions. A child who could sense the coming winter might one day save their family. In this way, the turning of seasons became a school, with the earth as teacher and time as curriculum. Yet even as the cycles were understood, they remained awe-inspiring. When the first snow blanketed the world in silence, fireside songs carried both fear and wonder. When the rains returned, turning dust into rivers, laughter and relief echoed through valleys. The land was alive, shifting moods like a great being. To the tribes, each season was a face of that being, a god who wore many masks. Over generations, this cyclical vision shaped the very identity of the people. They did not see themselves as builders of permanence, but as travelers on an endless road, one that curved back upon itself each year. Their shelters were temporary, their possessions few, for they knew the land itself would always call them onward. Time was not measured in numbers, but in cycles. 3 winters since a child's birth, 5 springs since the last great flood. The turning of seasons also forged resilience. With each cycle endured, the tribes grew stronger. They learned to prepare, to adapt, to trust the signs. Hunger became a teacher, storms a lesson, abundance a reminder to share. Through the seasons, humanity matured. And so, the lost continent became not just a place of survival, but of rhythm. The people who lived there walked in harmony with the earth's breath, their lives braided into the endless turning of time. Each sunrise, each storm, each thaw and bloom was both a challenge and a gift. In the turning of seasons, they found not only survival but meaning, the sense that life itself was part of a greater, eternal cycle, one that stretched beyond memory, beyond tribe, beyond even the continent itself. For countless generations, the tribes of the lost continent lived close to the edge of survival. Their world was unpredictable. Floods drowned valleys, fires consumed forests, and predators prowled in the darkness. Yet beneath the fear and hardship lay a growing awareness. Patterns existed. The sun returned after every night. The rains followed the stars. New life rose where death had left only silence. These patterns whispered of meaning. And slowly, meaning became myth. At first, belief was simple and immediate. The wind that howled through the canyons was alive. The river that flooded without warning had intent. The sun was a guardian that brought warmth, and the moon a watchful spirit that lit the night. Lightning, fire, thunder, all were voices of powers greater than any tribe. The world seemed animated by unseen presences, and to live among them required respect. Stories emerged to give these forces shape. Elders told of a great mother who birthed the earth, her body becoming mountains, her breath the wind. Others spoke of a hunter spirit whose spear was lightning, striking down trees to remind humans of their frailty. Every landscape, each river, each forest, each stone that stood alone on the plain, was folded into these narratives. To tell a story was not to entertain but to explain, to weave mystery into memory. As the tribes observed the cycles of seasons, belief deepened. The dying of winter and rebirth of spring demanded explanation. Some said a god descended into the underworld each winter, returning with the flowers in spring. Others believed the sun itself was a warrior battling through the darkness of cold months before triumphing again. These myths gave rhythm not just to survival, but to imagination, transforming the cruelty of hunger and frost into a grand story in which humanity played a role. Rituals followed belief. To light a fire was no longer only practical, it was symbolic. The flame became a piece of the sun, borrowed from the heavens. Water drawn from a river was not just to drink, but to share in the river spirit's gift. When hunters made a kill, they left offerings, bones, feathers, or blood, to honor the animal's soul. In this way, belief became action, and action reinforced belief. The earliest shrines were simple, a circle of stones where fires were lit, a carved totem from the trunk of a tree, a cave wall painted with handprints. Yet even these were sacred thresholds where the human world touched the spirit world. A tribe might gather around such places before migrations, asking for guidance, or after storms, giving thanks for survival. The land itself became a temple, its features inscribed with layers of meaning. Music and dance became central to belief. Around fires, bodies moved in rhythm with drums, feet striking earth in imitation of thunder. Voices rose in chants that echoed against the dark, summoning courage and unity. The dances were more than celebration, they were communication with the unseen. In trance-like movement, humans sought to touch the spirits, to bring themselves closer to the cycles that ruled their lives. Symbols also began to appear, etched into bone, painted on stone, carved into wood. Spirals represented the endless turning of seasons. Circles marked the unity of sun, moon, and earth. Handprints declared presence. We were here, and the spirits were here with us. These symbols, repeated and refined, became the seeds of sacred art, carrying belief across generations. As myths grew, so did their complexity. Heroes and tricksters emerged, figures who walked between the human and the divine. Some were animals imbued with wisdom, wolves who taught hunting, birds who carried messages to the sky. Others were human ancestors remembered so vividly they became immortal, living on as guardians of their descendants. Belief, once scattered and instinctive, now formed into shared narratives that bound tribes together. But belief was not only comfort, it was also fear. To break a ritual, to fail to honor the spirits, was to invite disaster. A hunt gone wrong, a storm that destroyed shelter, an illness that spread through the camp, these could be read as punishment. Belief carried both the balm of meaning and the burden of responsibility. The invisible world demanded not only reverence but obedience. Over time, spiritual leaders emerged, shamans, seers, storytellers. These were individuals who claimed to walk between worlds, to hear the whispers of spirits in dreams, in visions, in the patterns of flame and smoke. They healed with herbs, guided migrations, and declared taboos. Their authority came not from strength but from the perception of connection to the unseen. Through them, belief began to organize itself, forming the earliest structures of spiritual power. The dawn of belief also reshaped human identity. Tribes no longer saw themselves merely as survivors in a vast wilderness. They became participants in a cosmic drama, allies and rivals of spirits, children of gods, inheritors of sacred stories. To be human was to belong not only to a tribe, but to a myth. Belief gave existence a context larger than the individual life, stretching from the first ancestors into the endless future. This shift carried profound consequences. With shared myths, tribes could unite more deeply, binding not only through blood, but through story. Songs and symbols became a common language, allowing groups to recognize kinship even across distance. Conflict, too, took on new dimensions. Battles were not only for land or food, but for which spirits were strongest, whose gods deserved sacrifice. In this way, belief seeded both cooperation and rivalry. Yet despite differences, all beliefs shared one truth: they transformed fear into meaning. The roar of thunder was terrifying, but as the voice of a god, it became comprehensible. Death was final, but as a passage to the spirit world, it became bearable. Hunger, storms, and loss were no longer random cruelties, they were part of a story humans could tell themselves. And in that story, humanity found resilience. The dawn of belief was not a single moment, but a slow awakening. Over countless nights of firelight and countless days of migration, humans stitched meaning into the fabric of the world. What began as awe became myth. What began as fear became ritual. What began as survival became faith. And so, on the lost continent, where the first tribes lived, belief was born. It was fragile, shifting, always changing, yet enduring. It carried within it the seeds of future religions, philosophies, and civilizations. But in its earliest form, it was simple: the recognition that life was more than survival, that the world was alive with spirit, and that to live was to participate in a sacred mystery. The lost continent is gone. Its mountains have eroded, its rivers changed course, its forests turned to dust or ocean floor. The camps of the first tribes lie buried beneath layers of stone and silence. And yet, though the land has vanished, its echoes remain, carried in the patterns of human thought, in the songs of memory, in the way we still search for meaning. Every belief we hold, every story we tell, is in some way a descendant of those first myths whispered under the stars. When a parent soothes a child with a tale of the moon, when a community gathers to celebrate a season's turning, when we pause in awe before lightning or fire, we are reliving the oldest traditions of the human journey. Though we rarely recognize it, the voices of the lost continent still hum beneath our words. The tribes who once roamed its valleys were the first to transform survival into significance. For them, hunting was not just killing, it was entering into a sacred exchange with the animal spirit. Fire was not only warmth, it was a fragment of the sun, a reminder of the god's presence. Birth was not simply a beginning, it was a continuation of ancestral cycles, a renewal of the tribe's story. These meanings, born in prehistory, have traveled with us into the present. Consider the persistence of ritual. Today, we light candles on birthdays, set stones on graves, mark moments with music and ceremony. Though the forms have changed, the impulse is the same: to frame existence within a story, to affirm that life is not random but woven with significance. Rituals are echoes of the first dances around the fire, the first chants beneath the stars. Symbols, too, endure. The circle remains sacred in cultures around the world, representing eternity, wholeness, and return. Spirals, crosses, and stars, motifs carved into ancient bone or painted on stone, still appear in our art, our flags, our architecture. What began as marks scratched into caves on the lost continent has become the vast language of symbolism that saturates our civilizations. Even our philosophies carry the imprint of ancient awe. The idea that life follows cycles, that birth and death are not ends but transitions, originates in the rhythms first observed by hunter-gatherers watching the moon and seasons. The idea that unseen forces shape existence, once spirits of rivers and winds, lingers in modern concepts of fate, destiny, or the unseen laws of nature. Our sciences may have grown precise, but their roots lie in the same soil of wonder. And then there is story itself. Humanity has always told tales, but the first stories, those of the lost continent, set the pattern. They explained not only the world but also the self. They gave identity, comfort, and continuity. Today, when we watch films, read novels, or share family histories, we are continuing the same act, weaving experience into narrative, searching for meaning through imagination. The echoes are not only cultural. They live within us, in the architecture of our minds. Neuroscientists note that humans are wired for pattern seeking, that we instinctively search for connections, even in randomness. This impulse is ancient, born in the long nights when survival depended on recognizing the signs of weather, the paths of animals, the cycles of stars. The very structure of thought is shaped by the needs of those first tribes. In this sense, we are never far from them. Their fears remain ours, hunger, death, uncertainty. Their hopes remain ours, safety, love, renewal. Their dreams, of connection to something greater, of belonging to a story larger than the self, still pulse within us. Across tens of thousands of years, the distance between them and us is smaller than it seems. The lost continent may be a place erased by time, but it also represents something timeless. The origin of meaning. It is less a geography than a memory, less a vanished land than an eternal beginning. To speak of it is to speak of the birth of human imagination, the moment when survival transformed into culture, when existence became a story. And so, when we close our eyes and picture those first tribes, gathering around a fire, painting their hands upon stone, chanting to the rhythm of drums, we are not only imagining strangers. We are imagining ourselves in an earlier form. We are recognizing that their lives, fragile and fleeting, are part of our own lineage. We carry them forward in every gesture of meaning, in every belief, in every song. The lost continent lives in our rituals, our symbols, our myths. It lives in our yearning for the infinite, our awe at the universe, our grief at loss, our celebration of life. It lives in the persistence of hope, that beyond the hardship of existence, there is beauty, connection, and story. To remember the lost continent is to remember that humanity is ancient, fragile, and yet enduring. That we are not only creatures of flesh but of memory and imagination. That even in the harshest landscapes, humans have always found a way to create meaning, and to pass that meaning forward. The first tribes are gone, their continent erased, but their legacy remains alive in us. When we speak of gods, when we search the stars, when we build temples of stone or temples of thought, we are answering the same questions they once asked. Who are we? Why are we here? What is the story of life? Perhaps the greatest echo of all is this, the awareness that we are part of a continuum stretching backward into mystery and forward into possibility. That every generation inherits the fire from those who came before, tending it, reshaping it, and passing it onward. We are the living memory of the lost continent, the latest verse in humanity's longest song. And as the fire burns low, as the night grows quiet, we can still hear it, the distant rhythm of drums, the whisper of stories, the voices of the first tribes carried across time. The lost continent has not vanished. It has simply transformed, becoming part of us, a land that endures, not in maps but in memory, not in stone but in spirit. The echoes continue.